Moral Psychology Research Group Conference, the Consortium on Moral Decision Making here at Penn State. We're doing a series of roundtables just to get folks talking and continuing to converse about the relationship between philosophy and psychology. I'm joined by Syropoulos at Boston, who's moving to Arizona State in the fall. Taylor, who's in psychology. Taylor Davis, philosophy from Purdue University. Jordan Wylie, psychology at Boston College, moving to Cornell University in the fall. And Evan Westra, philosophy from Purdue. And yeah, I thought in this conversation today, one starting point for the discussion, and then we can see where it goes, would be to think about what is something exciting you see for the future of moral psychology and its intersection with moral philosophy. Anything in particular that you think is uniquely, personally kind of interesting in this space?
I think that one role that philosophy can have, or moral philosophy more generally can have within the field of moral psychology, is kind of figuring out how to draw connections between different literatures and different subfields within psychology. Because we're not, for the most part, in labs, and we can kind of jump around and try to sort of maybe get out a little bit ahead of the data in the interest of kind of painting a bigger picture. So, one example of this that I've been thinking about lately is, on the one hand, you have this literature from that goes back all the way to the 70s of these findings that people's moral behavior is influenced by situational effects, or that maybe it turns out that what we might think of as virtue is rare, that people are influenced by all kinds of social motives and biases. And this can seem kind of surprising a little bit, that that people are sort of not all that great, only weakly motivated to be moral in a lot of contexts. Then on the other hand, you have literature that studies moral judgment, how we make third-party moral judgments of other people. And we are extremely judgy of other people. And we are, we're very vigilant, monitoring people for their underlying intentions, and whether we think that are they being hypocrites, are they actually motivated by morality, or are they motivated by something else? So those two things are interesting on their own, but what's interesting is thinking about how they fit together. Mm-hmm. And so one story is we might be weakly motivated to be moral or altruistic, but we're very strongly motivated by what other people think of us. And then we are also extremely strongly motivated to make judgments about each other. Those two literatures, you can start to see them as two pieces of a puzzle that can fit together, where it seems like there's a regulative effect of the sort of third-party aspects of morality that in some way compensates for the weakness or fragility of the first-person aspects of morality. So that's the kind of role that I see philosophy can play, is maybe thinking about, okay, how did all these pieces fit together?
Yeah, so I was thinking about something related to that from the psychology point of view. So I think many people talk about this who are psychologists that interact with philosophers, philosophy helps bring conceptual clarity to, pressing people to define their terms and stuff like that. That's all true, and I think really good. But I also think that psychologists can have a tendency to get stuck in the paradigm that they're using, whatever that might be, an economic game or something like that. I study punishment a lot of the time, and there, a ton of work on punishment is in the context of economic games, and then the motivation that brought people to the game, you start to lose it over time, and then it becomes about the features of the game and people's decision making, just in that context. But when you go back to philosophy and read philosophy about punishment, I think it's really quite easy to see that we need to move back out from being stuck in this thing, and that's one place where, at least in my own work, it's been really helpful to link up things that have been traditionally kind of separate.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, how earlier in the talks people were describing how too little of a virtue is a vice, too much of a virtue is also a vice because of excess. It's kind of like you need psychology, moral psychology, and moral philosophy to intersect so that you are not only focusing on the terminology and defining constructs, and you're also not only like focusing on your paradigms, but you also need to understand the mechanisms behind them and the argumentation behind them. So it's like, in moderation, both of them combined always lead to a more comprehensive output.
And some of the assumptions too. I mean, my closest example of that is I gave a talk at the philosopher Senator Armstrong's lab at Duke many years ago. He was also here at the conference, and it was on empathy as a choice. And I was using this paradigm of choosing empathy, and it was a philosophy lab. And on the first slide, you spent about half an hour just talking, what does empathy mean? What does choice mean? And like having those conversations, kind of think, given that macro level perspective, can be really helpful sometimes.
Totally.
I was actually going to jump in and add, like the way you framed the question was, moral philosophy have to add to moral psychology, and I think it's actually kind of important in this context to maybe take the moral philosophy out of that. It's not that moral philosophy doesn't have anything to add, it's just that what philosophy has to add, I think in general, is actually a lot more relevant, a lot more important. I do see, like, I was actually saying to Evan earlier, I mean, I teach some ethics classes where I see on the ground in real life in the way that I make students analyze cases that autonomy concerns and concerns about freedom are, first of all, logically just not harm and not fairness. And second of all, nobody talks about that much in psychology, and I don't know if that's moral philosophy. I mean, it's the philosophy of something, but I'm not a moral philosopher. I don't do that. I'm a philosopher of cognitive science and sort of a philosopher of science. And I think when I'm seeing that, I'm in a way not seeing that even when I'm looking at norms of autonomy in the context of morality. I'm kind of not seeing that as a moral philosopher would. I'm just seeing it as a kind of scientific philosopher who's looking at patterns and sort of like, here's a pattern that's being missed. And then I think just more broadly, like my image of what philosophy has to bring to science is much more about just quite generally how do things fit together. And so you do need to be able to, whatever's going on in moral philosophy, that needs to fit in too. But it really, I feel like the philosopher's role is to sort of try to always be looking at how does all of it fit together.
And the names we use for this too. I remember I was at once asked, do you consider yourself like a moral psychologist? Like as a subfield of psychology. And I thought it's kind of an interesting question because it really is. I mean, I draw upon emotion research and social cognition, and I talk with philosophers, and so it's very. I feel like many of us are taking a very problem-focused approach. Like in the terms we use to define ourselves, it's kind of an interesting question how useful they are for advancing this debate. These debates.
Just tagging on that. I mean, one way of looking at moral psychology, defining it as a field, is by its domain.
Right.
And like you would say cancer research or sustainability science or something, where you're not naming it, you're not identifying the field by the things that you're actually studying, the mental states that do the explaining. You're identifying the field by what's getting explained, and what's getting explained is something more like a set of problems or something. It's not a thing in the world. It's not a natural domain. It's just a bunch of problems, practical problems that we have. But science can help with them, and so it's like, well, let's just do the science that we need for these practical purposes.
Kind of going in the other direction of like what psychology can do for philosophy, I'll say like first off, like I think that some of the best philosophers that I read are psychologists, and I think that there are a lot of psychologists who are just like incredibly insightful and are doing really great theoretical work that is like very much like inspiring me to explore philosophical problems and normative problems that are sort of downstream of them. So like an example is if you kind of have a certain picture of human nature that emerges from psychology, that emerges from moral psychology, that like highlights various like ways in which human beings are imperfect and like deviate sometimes very significantly from certain kinds of ethical and moral ideals. How can we as philosophers like recalibrate our conceptions of normative concepts like agency or like moral change or moral progress in light of the insights that we're getting from excellent work coming from moral psychologists.
Also, there's the role, I think, of exploration, which, in a way, is something that I've been thinking about in this conference and in this sort of context, where philosophers just assume, I think it's just built deeply into us, that like the way you find out what questions you need to ask is by theory. You use theory to do it. Whereas I think the way psychologists fundamentally seem to be approached is you don't use theory, you just find interesting stuff and go explore like phenomena. You just like look at the phenomena. I think that's good. Somebody should do both of those things. Maybe it's good for somebody to just be like, well, what's going on with this? We haven't looked at this. We haven't studied this. And then just maybe there's something here. And theory doesn't do that for you.
And it seems like, to speak to Stylianos, your work, and Jordan, your work in this space, you're both taking problem-focused approaches, but also digging into theory to explore. In your case, think about how we complicate our understanding of future agents. In some of your work, how we complicate our thinking of rules and different normative rules that we engage with. It seems like there's ways to take a step back and use philosophy and work with philosophers to rethink what are the targets, what are the landscapes we're evaluating, and the problems we're trying to address.
Yeah, absolutely. At least for me, I think, readings from effective altruism and long-termism from Oxford have been probably the most influential readings I've had for my research in the last couple of years. And they're all generating these ideas that are philosophically interesting, but are stopping at actually testing the human aspects of it. And so it's just, to me, the perfect food for thought that I can then take and compartmentalize and test in specific ways in the lab, which to me creates the perfect blend of theory from philosophy, practical application in psychology, always seeking to address a particular issue. In this case, at least for my work, trying to understand how we can optimize impartial beneficence for future people.
Yeah, and in my work, I feel like I have been sort of steeped in this literature, and then there's something about it that I couldn't put my finger on for a really long time. Something about it just doesn't feel like it's explaining all that I think it should explain in this literature. And then turning to philosophy to look at what are the theories of punishment that can how do they map on to this thing, and then that from that spring a whole research program on there are discrepancies here. What are lay folks' intuitions about punishment when we ask these questions in slightly different ways that are informed by this literature? And it's been just a super rich space to explore as a psychologist. Again, sort of blending the practical question area that I'm interested in and empirical methods with this rich long history of writing about punishment from philosophy.
So I think that's a good place for us to close. But I really appreciate all of you taking time to do this at the end of the conference. Thanks so much. I think it's been fun to watch these conversations happen. So thanks again.
A lot of fun.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jerry.
Cool.
Thank you, Tom.